That morning, nobody knew the Golden Horn would run red with Byzantine blood. June 18th, 860 AD, 200 Viking longships emerged from the Black Sea mist, like demons rising from hell itself. Their dragon prows cut through Byzantine waters, with the silence of death approaching. At their head sailed the most terrifying name the Eastern Empire had ever heard, Askold of Kiev, the Viking prince who had carved his way from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Behind him came 8,000 warriors who had never seen defeat, men who wore Byzantine gold, torn from burning churches, who carried axes that had tasted the blood of emperors, who sailed toward the greatest prize in Christendom itself. Defending Constantinople stood the heir to Rome itself, the Byzantine Empire that had survived barbarian invasions, Arab conquests, and Bulgarian wars. Emperor Michael III commanded the strongest navy in the Mediterranean, the most sophisticated defenses in the world, walls that had never fallen to siege. A city so wealthy that its streets were paved with gold. They had crushed every enemy foolish enough to approach their sacred capital, never imagined that salvation and destruction could arrive simultaneously in the form of northern ships sailing south like harbingers of the end times. But the Byzantines had made a fatal assumption. They had prepared their defenses against armies that approached by land, against fleets that fought like civilized navies, against enemies who followed the ancient rules of siege warfare. What sailed toward them instead was something entirely unprecedented, a floating army that turned seas into highways and water into conquest, an enemy that could strike at the heart of empire, while Byzantine forces watched helplessly from golden walls. Warriors who fought with a fury that made Byzantine steel seem like children's toys. The Vikings called it Miklagard, the great city. Constantinople was the richest target in the known world, a metropolis where a single church contained more gold than entire kingdoms possessed, where silk and spices flowed like rivers through markets that dazzled northern eyes, where the Hagia Sophia rose like a mountain of marble and precious metal toward heaven itself. For generations, Vikings had dreamed of plundering this ultimate prize. Now that dream sailed toward reality on 200 dragon ships. Emperor Michael III ruled the most sophisticated civilization on earth, heir to 1,000 years of Roman tradition, commander of Greek fire that could burn on water itself, master of diplomatic networks that stretched from Britain to India. His capital had withstood every threat for centuries. The queen of cities had never fallen to barbarian assault, never paid tribute to northern pirates, never imagined that its greatest danger would come not from familiar enemies, but from the frozen seas beyond the world's edge. But the Vikings had spent decades preparing for this moment. Askold was no simple raider seeking easy plunder. He was a strategic genius who understood Byzantine weaknesses better than the Byzantines themselves. He had studied their naval tactics, mapped their harbor defenses, identified the exact moments when Constantinople was most vulnerable. Most importantly, he knew the one thing that could bring the Eastern Empire to its knees: fear. Fear that the center of Orthodox Christianity could be burned by pagan fires, that the new Rome could fall like the old. The Bosphorus stretched like a golden thread between Europe and Asia, the narrow strait that controlled trade between the Mediterranean and Black Seas, between the Christian world and the barbarian darkness beyond. Constantinople commanded this passage like a jeweled dagger thrust into the throat of two continents. Every ship that passed paid tribute to Byzantine merchants. Every trade route enriched imperial coffers. The city that controlled the Bosphorus controlled the wealth of the world. June had brought the perfect sailing weather that made the Black Sea navigable to the largest fleets. Waters ran calm and deep, carrying the dragon fleet toward the heart of Christian empire. With the inevitability of destiny itself, coastal settlements that tried to warn Constantinople were silenced before their messages could be sent. Fishing villages vanished beneath Viking axes. Merchant ships disappeared into northern holds like pebbles into the sea. The approach was as silent as death itself. The Byzantine response revealed everything wrong with imperial military thinking. A navy designed to fight other civilized fleets. Tactics perfected against Arab dhows and Bulgar riverboats. Commanders who had never faced enemies that treated the sea like Vikings treated battlefields. While Byzantine admirals debated strategy in marble halls, Vikings struck like lightning and vanished before dawn. By the time imperial forces understood what they faced, dragon ships had penetrated to the heart of the empire itself. Patriarch Photius stood in the Hagia Sophia and felt the earth tremble beneath his feet, not from earthquake, but from the rhythm of 16,000 oars beating against Byzantine waters. The greatest church in Christendom had never heard such sounds. The prayers of the faithful mixed with war cries in languages that predated Christ himself. For the first time in its history, Constantinople faced enemies who cared nothing for its sacred character, who saw only gold where Orthodox eyes saw divine glory. The Viking fleet that entered the Golden Horn defied every naval principle the Byzantines knew. Ships that seemed too large to float, too fast to catch, too numerous to count. Each longship was a masterpiece of northern engineering. Shallow drafts that could navigate waters where Byzantine galleys ran aground. Flexible hulls that rode waves like living things. Most terrifyingly, crews trained from childhood to fight as extensions of their vessels. These weren't just sailors manning warboats. These were seaborne warriors whose ships were weapons incarnate. Admiral Constantine Lips commanded the Byzantine fleet from his flagship, a massive galley that had never known defeat. Behind him floated the most advanced warships in the world, vessels armored with bronze, armed with Greek fire, crewed by professional sailors who had conquered the Mediterranean. But as Viking ships poured into the Golden Horn like a flood of northern death, the admiral felt something he had never experienced before: doubt. How do you fight enemies who treat water like solid ground, who board enemy ships like cavalry charging across plains? The first engagement shattered every assumption Byzantine naval doctrine was built upon. Imperial galleys moved to block the harbor mouth, their bronze rams gleaming in morning sunlight. Greek fire weapons prepared to turn the sea itself into an inferno. Disciplined crews stood ready to demonstrate why Byzantine naval power was feared from Britain to Egypt. Then the Vikings did something no civilized navy would attempt. They rammed their own ships into Byzantine vessels with suicidal fury. What happened next defied every law of naval warfare. The Byzantines understood. Viking ships, built for flexibility, absorbed impacts that should have shattered them. Bronze rams, designed to pierce enemy hulls, skittered off curved northern timbers like arrows off shields. Meanwhile, Viking warriors poured across the gaps between vessels like wolves, leaping between ice floes. Battle axes rose and fell. Byzantine sailors, trained for civilized combat, found themselves fighting berserkers who laughed at wounds that would fell normal men. The Greek fire that was supposed to save Constantinople became its doom. When imperial crews triggered their flame weapons, expecting to incinerate Viking ships like kindling, something went catastrophically wrong. The Northerners had prepared for this moment. Wet hides covered their vessels. Water barrels stood ready for dousing flames. Most shockingly, they used the fire against its creators. Flaming projectiles were caught on shields and hurled back at Byzantine ships. The weapon that had made imperial fleets invincible became the instrument of their destruction. Captain Nikephoros watched his crew burn alive around him as Greek fire consumed his own vessel. The flames that should have protected Constantinople were devouring Byzantine sailors, while Vikings stood untouched behind their preparations. His last sight was of a Viking warrior, face painted blue with woad, leading his men across a bridge of burning ships toward the heart of the Golden Horn. The technological advantage that had sustained Byzantine naval power for centuries died in those flames. But the real shock came when Viking tactics revealed their true sophistication. These weren't barbarian pirates striking blindly at walls. They were strategic thinkers who had identified Constantinople's critical weakness. The harbor districts, where merchant ships loaded the wealth of the world, the docks, where grain ships from Egypt fed the million souls of the imperial capital, the warehouses, where silk from China and spices from India waited for distribution across Europe. Askold had studied Byzantine psychology as carefully as Byzantine defenses. He understood that Constantinople's strength was also its vulnerability. 1 million people required constant supply from across the empire. Cut those supply lines, and the greatest city in the world would starve within weeks. More importantly, threaten the wealth that made Byzantine power possible, and even the bravest defenders would consider negotiation. The Prince of Kiev had come not just to raid, but to strangle the empire at its source. The landing that followed redefined urban warfare for generations. Viking warriors didn't attempt to storm the Great Palace or assault the Theodosian walls. Instead, they targeted the commercial districts where Constantinople's real power lay. Warehouses full of silk and gold, docks lined with merchant vessels from every corner of the known world, markets where a single hour's plunder could equal a year's raiding in poorer lands. The systematic destruction that followed was economically devastating and psychologically crushing. Emperor Michael III faced a choice that would haunt Byzantine nightmares for generations. Fight a battle he couldn't win, or watch his capital's wealth disappear into northern ships. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. 200 Viking vessels could carry away more treasure than the imperial navy could protect. Each day, the siege continued cost more than military victory could justify. For the first time in its history, the new Rome faced enemies who understood that economic warfare could be more devastating than military conquest. What the Byzantines found most shocking was Viking discipline under pressure. These weren't savage raiders burning randomly. They were organized forces executing a systematic plan, teams assigned to specific targets, priorities established for different types of plunder, even withdrawal routes planned before the first sword was drawn. The barbarians, who were supposed to represent chaos, demonstrated military organization that surpassed imperial standards. The siege weapons that appeared on Viking ships defied Byzantine understanding of northern capabilities. Catapults built to specifications that suggested familiarity with Roman engineering. Siege towers, designed to attack from floating platforms. Most disturbing, Greek fire projectors that had somehow been captured and reverse-engineered. The technological gap that was supposed to guarantee imperial superiority had disappeared entirely. Patriarch Photius led prayers that shook the foundations of the Hagia Sophia as Viking axes rang against Byzantine bronze throughout the harbor districts. The greatest church in Christendom had never heard such sounds of destruction so close to its sacred walls. Citizens who had lived their entire lives in the world's most secure city suddenly understood what barbarian conquest meant. Not just the loss of life or property, but the end of everything that made their civilization possible. The breakthrough came when Vikings discovered the one thing that could bring Constantinople to its knees faster than any siege. The imperial granaries, where Egypt's wheat fed the capital's 1 million inhabitants. Burning those stores wouldn't just threaten immediate starvation. It would trigger panic throughout the city, as people realized their survival depended on barbarian mercy. Askold had found the pressure point that could crack the Eastern Empire like an egg. But the Vikings carried a secret weapon more devastating than any axe or fire projector: information. Years of trading and raiding had taught them exactly where Constantinople's treasures lay, which churches held the most gold, which districts stored the richest goods, which officials could be bribed or intimidated. They moved through the city like men who had studied its layout for decades, because they had. The counterattack that Byzantine forces launched revealed how completely imperial tactics had been compromised by Viking innovations. Heavy cavalry, designed for open battlefields, found themselves trapped in narrow streets where northern axes could reach them. Infantry formations, perfected against civilized enemies, dissolved into confusion when faced with berserkers who felt no pain and knew no fear. Even the Varangian Guard, elite troops recruited from northern lands, hesitated when facing warriors who might be their own kinsmen. Within a generation, Viking raids increased tenfold across the Byzantine sphere. Rivers from the Danube to the Don carried dragon ships into the heart of the Eastern Empire. The tactics perfected at Constantinople spread to every waterway that could float a warship. Monasteries moved inland. Trade shifted to overland routes. Coastal settlements emptied as populations fled to fortified cities that might withstand what Constantinople barely survived.